Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We'll be starting here in approximately 2 minutes. Hello, my name is Daniel Schoonmaker. I'm the Executive Director of Michigan Sustainable Business Forum. I'm pleased to welcome you to today's presentation of the Michigan Sustainable Business Forum webinar series. For those who are not familiar with our organization, the forum is a collaboration of businesses and institutions dedicated to promoting practices in advanced climate leadership, social justice, and the creation of a circular economy. We host events and programs throughout the states, including this monthly Michigan Sustainable Business Forum webinar series. Which we are proud to have sponsored and underwritten by Chopin. A couple of upcoming in-person events I'd like to highlight. First, next Tuesday, August 23rd, we'll be hosting an end of summer celebration for sustainability practitioners and stakeholders in Southeast Michigan, specifically the Ann Arbor area, featuring networking, yard games, craft beer, and a short program on climate solutions and circularity. Our fireside chat, campfire chat in the lodge, will feature Sean Patterson, Vice President of Environmental Management Safety for DTE, and Vicki Lewis, founder and CEO of recycling leader of BMX International LLC. We'll be gathering at Camp Woodbury to take in the beautiful views of Mormon Lake and the historic lodge. This event is free with registration. Please join us in Dexter, Michigan, in the Ann Arbor area next Tuesday. Then on August 30th, we'll host a Green Drinks event featuring a short program on advancing climate action and renewable energy in greater Southwest Michigan, hosted by Innovatus Solar technically on the Indiana border in South Bend, Michigan, South Bend, Indiana. Finally, please consider becoming a member of the forum. If you're already a corporate institutional member of one of our regional programs, a professional MISBF membership is complimentary. If not, you become a professional member today for only $50. Now I'd like to introduce our program and featured speaker, Increasing Acceptance and Use of Compostable Products in Michigan. For our attendees, please note that you can share thoughts and questions with the panelists or all the attendees through the chat function. We'll have time at the end of the presentation today for open questions and answers. Our featured speaker is Rhodes Yepsen, Executive Director of the Biodegradable Products Institute, BPI, a nonprofit advocate of the value of certified compostable packaging in diverting organic waste to composting. Yepsen's expertise is on systems-based solutions, specifically the synergy in solving for food waste and packaging at the same time, to address climate change, ecosystem impacts, and regenerative agriculture. He served on the board of the U.S. Composting Council, on the advisory council for the U.S. Plastics Pack, and was an editor and writer at Biocycle magazine. Rhodes, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to join your group, and thanks so much for tuning in today. Let's talk about compostable products and packaging.
All right, Rhodes, the screen is yours.
All right, well, thank you, again, so much for inviting me. I'd like to talk to you a little bit today about compostable packaging and products and what's being done to increase acceptance and use of these products in Michigan and across the United States. I'll give a little bit of an introduction about myself and the organization that I work for those of you who don't know me. We'll talk a little bit about the connection of food scraps and packaging in the circular economy, BPI's roadmap, and some of the work that we're doing to address barriers to acceptance of packaging, and some opportunities to support compost infrastructure. So as you heard, I won't repeat this introduction, but I've been in the composting world for about 15 years, starting at Biocycle magazine. And really what drew me to the work at BPI back in 2016 was this connection between food waste and composting and sustainable packaging. And I think that as you'll hear today, there are some really good connections between these two areas that oftentimes are separate when we think about sustainable packaging on the one side and then food waste and composting on the other. So a little bit about BPI. BPI was founded as a nonprofit back in 1999. And as you heard, we're really focused on promoting the production, use, and appropriate end of life for materials that break down in specific environments, such as commercial composting. We do this through several programmatic areas. Most notably is our certification program, which we'll talk about a little bit, which is really based on a science-driven, technically credible way of determining that something is compostable and communicating that across the value chain. We also have programs around education, where we're driving awareness of composting and compostable packaging across the value chain, and then our advocacy efforts, which are really around expanding the actual opportunities to compost these materials. So making sure that they can be collected and processed at scale. So a little bit about our certification program. When we think about compostability certification, primarily we're thinking about the standards that items are tested and certified against. You can see that on the left-hand side here with the ASTM standards. So we have two standards in the United States for compostability: ASTM D6400, which is for plastic-like materials, and D6868, which is for materials that are more complex and have some paper or fiber elements. It's not just one test that you need to do to complete verification to these standard specifications. There actually are several tests. The first one that is most notable is disintegration. This is what people typically think of when they're thinking of compostability, which is that physical visual breakdown of an item in the compost pile. So this test is done on all finished formats of an item. So the finished product or package must go through this test. We also have tests on biodegradation in a compost environment, which is looking at the constituents that go into a package. And this is really looking at the invisible process of microorganisms eating the organic carbon in a plastic material. We measure this through CO2 evolution to make sure that the microorganisms are actually eating the plastic. It's not just breaking down into small microplastics. Finally, there are a series of tests looking at no adverse impacts on the compost. This is things like heavy metals testing. We use the same heavy metals test used for compost quality and for EPA regulations on compost. as well as an OECD International Plant Toxicity Test. So these are all kind of baked into the ASTM standards. Anyone who's certifying would certify to these standards would cover these things. On the right-hand side, you'll see additional requirements that a certifier like BPI adds in to make sure that we're increasing the chances that the item will be successfully collected and composted. One, for instance, is adding in criteria that are impacting composters, like PFAS. So PFAS has been becoming a bigger and bigger topic in the news, a lot of concern around what this may be doing to humans and animals in the environment. Composters are starting to get regulated. This is where BPI comes in. So as composters have to start testing their finished compost or their contact water for PFAS, we sort of dug in and said, we need to make sure that we are not one of the sources of PFAS for compost facilities. And we instituted a prohibition on the intentional use of PFAS and put in some tests in place to screen to make sure that it wasn't getting in there. We also have eligibility criteria. Just because something can meet those ASTM standards for compostability doesn't mean that it should necessarily be designed to be compostable. We'll get into this a little bit more, but really the three main things that we're looking at for eligibility are the type of application. So is it connected to food scraps and yard trimmings that are collected for composting? It can't be a better fit for recycling. We don't want to have compostable water bottles or things that have high recycling rates. This is not good for recyclers who may be concerned about contamination. It's not good for composters or consumers who are going to be confused about what bin to put it in. Finally, it can't require disassembly. We know that consumers are pretty unlikely to disassemble something in order to recycle or compost it. We don't want to add any chances of contamination for the composter. The third criteria that we'll talk a little bit about today are efforts to make sure that the item is easily identifiable. So BPI certification is a little unique. We require the item to be marked. So the packaging must have the BPI certification mark, and the mark also must be on product unless there is some technical limitation where it really physically cannot be added to the product. This is to make sure that the item can be easily identified. All right, so a little bit about the eligibility criteria of connected to food scraps and the circular economy. This is probably the one that gets the most questions, with people wondering why we have this criteria and what does this really mean? What types of items are we rejecting from our certification based on this criteria? It's typically things like sneakers or clothing, electronics, general packaging that's not associated with food. And the reason for this really sort of goes into this, how do we make sure that we encourage and build opportunities for these materials to be collected and composted in reality? And when we think about the circular economy, it's not actually just one circle. There actually are a couple loops. And I think this Ellen MacArthur Foundation slide shows that well, where part of the circular economy is this blue set of loops, which is sort of a mechanical or technical loop. This is where, when we're talking about traditional recycling, about reuse, refurbishing materials, this all sort of fits into that blue loop on the right-hand side. When we think about composting or compostable packaging, we're looking at the biological loop, which is a totally separate loop. You can see, right, that it's renewable inputs. We're looking at things like composting, anaerobic digestion, farming as the loops, which are quite different from refurbishing and mechanical recycling. And so when we're thinking about how this relates to packaging and the connection of packaging to food, if we start to look at what's the current situation of packaging in the waste stream, this is sort of the first look at it, is what's going on today in terms of inputs into packaging, plastic packaging materials, and where is that going? We know, right, some of it's being landfilled, some of it's being collected for recycling. Well, how much of it is not actually getting recycled back into new products? And what about this leakage portion, right? A third of the problem is not landfill versus recycling. A third of it's being leaked into the environment. And so as we start looking at the solutions to that problem, a lot of the solutions for plastic packaging are not focused on composting, right? It's design and production for better use and reuse, for better recycling, ways to drastically reduce and limit the materials leaked into the environment. And it's only this small portion that I've circled in red that should be going to composting or anaerobic digestion, right? It's not the main focus of the packaging solution. And this is because it's connected to food, right? So that circular loop that was in green, not the blue loop. And I think this is what is so exciting when we think about compostable packaging. Once we sort of get our heads set around what should or should not be redesigned as compostable, is that suddenly we've got this great compelling story from a sustainability perspective, right? It's not just about the packaging itself and plastics in the ocean or microplastics in the soil, which are important, but we have now this connection to a bigger global momentum around climate change. And this slide from the World Resources Institute and the UN FAO shows that if food waste and loss for its own country, it would be the third largest greenhouse gas emitter in the world. This is a huge deal, right? So we're not talking about small peanuts when we connect packaging to the broader food waste movement. In the United States, it's no surprise, looking at the waste stream, again, sort of looking on the left side at what materials are generated and on the right side, what's going to landfills today. It's no surprise that food is such a problem, for climate change. When you look at the materials generated, food may only make up 15% of the generated materials. But once you look at recovery and the good job we're doing for recycling of certain materials and composting of yard trimmings, those numbers start to drop off for a lot of materials, but not for food. Food consistently is the #1 material sent to landfills at the national level and at the state level. Part of this, there are several reasons for this, but part of it is that we just don't have enough composting facilities taking food. There are quite a few composting facilities around the US. The last data from 2017, 4,700 facilities, primarily around yard trimmings. This was driven through a lot of state efforts in the 80s and 90s to prohibit landfilling of yard trimmings. Those bans, which took several different shapes, really incentivized the collection, even if it was seasonal, of yard trimmings and repurposing that through municipal composting sites. And of those facilities taking food, not many take compostable packaging today due to fears of contamination, right? If you, again, look back at that EPA slide, there's a lot of packaging in the waste stream and a significant portion is connected to food. So how do we separate that packaging from the food and take just the food? Or better yet, how do we start to redesign non-recyclable food contact items to be compostable to really facilitate the diversion of food scraps and the packaging? So that lack of access to food scrap composting is a problem not for businesses that are looking to divert their materials, as well as for households. So if we look at residential access to curbside composting or drop-off programs that are set up by municipalities, the number is growing significantly every year, percentage-wise, but it's still a pretty small portion of our population that has access to one of these programs. I would note that according to the last survey in BioCycle magazine, in Michigan, it's primarily Ann Arbor and Mackinac Island that have these curbside programs in the United States. There is a huge problem with this data, right? You can see these numbers are old, 2017. It's a real challenge to have consistent data on composting programs and curbside access. There may very well be more programs in Michigan that just aren't making it into this survey. BPI has been was a founding sponsor of Find a Composter. Actually, that's part of my full circle journey. When I was at BioCycle magazine, I was a part of the early stages of findacomposter.com, and then now 15 years later, I get to help bring Find a Composter over to BPI to sort of pump some new lifeblood into it. So we recently took it over and have invested in completely rebuilding the database. It's still a work in progress. We're going through and trying to verify the listings. We're talking to different associations about partnering on data collection and improving the web interface of this platform. We're also a longtime sponsor of BioCycle's surveys, both the facility surveys and the residential surveys. And we're in the process of adding that data, that residential data, to Find a Composter to kind of expand our sense of what does it mean when you say find a composter, right? For a business, finding the facility itself can be helpful, but for an individual, that's not necessarily that helpful to determine whether you can compost something in your community. You really need that residential access data. So this is a work in progress and something that we definitely think is very needed across the US. So let's talk a little bit about what can be done, what is being done, and what can be done to increase the acceptance of compostable products. So last year, BPI dug into this. We've been hearing for years, right, sort of that there are some general concerns and general barriers to the acceptance of compostable packaging. And last year we said, there still seems to be a problem, right? There's a disconnect. You know, we're hearing the problems. We state them back to composters or municipalities with these programs, and we're sort of hearing this, yeah, well, you got it partially right. You know, repeat back after me. And so we set up a series of surveys, interviews, and workshop sessions with stakeholders across the value chain last year to really work through what are these barriers? Can we agree on the barriers and really piece them out and be very specific about what they are? And then what are the future states? What does success look like for each of these barriers? And what are some projects that can help us get there? And what does getting there mean? And getting there, in our opinion, is really increased organics diversion via a single set of acceptability criteria for compostable products and packaging. And we'll talk about a couple of these today. We don't have time to dive into all of them, but we'll talk a little bit about these barriers in future states and projects. So probably the biggest one to talk about and focus on is contamination and labeling. There are a lot of things that are going to be needed to tackle contamination at composting facilities that are not related to compostable packaging, but some of it is related to compostable packaging and other packaging in the waste stream. And labeling is one of the quickest and most concrete ways that BPI and our members can address this. And primarily through on-item labeling. So as you heard in the beginning, when we talked about BPI certification, we're fairly unique in the requirement that our members use the BPI certification mark on packaging and on the item itself. And we have fairly in-depth guidelines on how and requirements on how this works. So that first effort really was BPI a few years ago, sort of thinking about what is in our power to sort of force our members to do. And this was the most clear-cut one. We had heard states around the country starting to look at labeling, and Washington State in particular starting to put bills forward requiring that compostable packaging be labeled appropriately, and certification and the use of a third-party certification mark were always in the mix of that discussion. So we said we really need to be building this into our requirements. The use of the BPI certification mark itself is not enough, right? It's a little swirl. And so we also developed BPI labeling guidelines. So these are not requirements from BPI for BPI members, but they're guidance as an industry association to our members and the broader value chain, explaining best practices for labeling, the challenges with labeling certain items. Think about small format items like straws. How do you label the straw itself? If it's not typically printed, you can't emboss it. You can color it, but is that enough? And so that document came out in 2020, really in response to the Washington State law, pushing for better labeling in compostable packaging. And we know we need to update it. It was a sort of a first brush out, and we're looking to be updating that and releasing a new version in 2023, especially looking at some consumer research and regulatory developments, which sort of cues in a connection to the Closed Loop and their composting consortium that launched this year. And they have several projects under consideration. One is going to be co-funded and co-led by BPI and the Closed Loop partners, which is looking at different consumer testing of these labeling guidelines and of other elements to really figure out what are the things that work best, right? So in our labeling guidelines, we've made some assumptions based on industry knowledge, but we really need to test those out with some consumer research. And then a lot of states are looking to pass similar laws to Washington or states like California around labeling of packaging or compostable packaging specifically. And what we've done is develop some guiding principles to help drive sort of some of the key things, right? Key definitions that could go into these laws, some base criteria that could go into these regulations. And we have a working group underway today between BPI and the U.S. Composting Council to try to get U.S. Composting Council's endorsement of these guidelines, updating them and making sure that they work for compostable products manufacturers and the composting facilities receiving them. So that's one set of barriers around contamination and labeling, and just shows how complex the topic of just labeling can be to address contamination, amongst other ways of addressing contamination. One of the other big barriers, probably one of the biggest ones that we hear about for compostable packaging acceptance, has to do with real world composting conditions versus lab conditions used to certify products. The way to address that is through field testing. And so after the workshop series last year, BPI undertook a research program to consolidate and publish a report on all publicly available field testing, which is available on our website. You can see a little screenshot of it here on the right. And it was interesting to show, right, that there are over 1,000 products that have passed robust field tests, most in as little as 49 days. So the underlying concern with real world conditions versus lab is around time. We know that time is not the only factor, but the lab tests are 12 weeks. We know a lot of composting facilities are shortening their time frame, trying to maximize their throughput. And so time frame is a really big concern. So this was encouraging to us to see that over 1,000 products breaking down in robust field testing programs, covering pretty much the majority of the categories of items that BPI certifies. One gap was around molded fiber products, which was pretty interesting, and not as many paper products as you'd think. So kind of the reverse of what we think of when we think of the problem being plastic-like compostables not breaking down. Actually, in the field tests, it looks like the paper and fiber items may be having as much or more trouble. But we don't really know just by looking at the passing test results. So the next step after publishing this report was to convene some stakeholders, U.S. Composting Council, Compost Council of Canada, some groups involved with field testing like CMA and the CREF and this compostable field testing program, to sort of figure out, okay, how do we advance this together? And what we really discussed was the need for a standardized independent test method for field testing. To harmonize, to make sure that we have comparable, repeatable data that can really better the composting industry and be used as a mechanism for a check and balance on the compostability specifications used for certification. So BPI registered an ASTM work item 8528, to develop this standardized test method. And we've been inviting stakeholders from across the US and Canada. The group meets monthly. It is very much a draft in progress. But we're making pretty good headway, considering it's only been a few months of the work item. And ultimately, what we're trying to do is build off of existing programs. So the compostable field testing program, which is a partnership of CREF, the Composting Research and Education Foundation, and BSI Bio, already has a pretty great established protocol for how to run a field test. So we're really leveraging that protocol in this ASTM method, and then adding in defined operating conditions and time frame so that we can get repeatable and comparable results. For those defined operating conditions, we're looking at the certified operator training course materials and conditions from the composting handbook published this year. And really the thought here is, how do we focus on the products and packaging that are not breaking down and narrow down why they aren't breaking down, rather than repeating a lot of tests on items that are consistently breaking down, and sort of start to isolate those two paths. The other aspect around field testing and real world conditions, not everyone is going to want to do a field test. That takes several months. It can disrupt your flow. And so we did want to make sure that everyone was aware on this webinar that we have another resource that's much easier to take advantage of, that's on our website. So if you are a composter or working with a composter and the facility says compostable packaging doesn't work for me, we want to know. We want to hear about this. We want to make sure, if it's a BPI certified item, we want to find that out. And so we have a simple online form that should be usable from a smartphone to take a picture of the item, say what the facility name is, what the item of concern is. Is it a plastic bag? Is it a piece of cutlery? Is it just some plastic fragment you don't know what it is? And submit that to us. We'll then help coordinate sending those samples to a lab where we'll pay for testing to identify whether it's a compostable plastic or not. This is really designed to build a feedback loop, right? We want to make sure that we know if somebody thinks our compostable items are not breaking down and figure out, is it truly compostable or not? We can say that we've not had too many requests for this service yet. We hope we get more. The first batch of samples were green bags and films from a California facility, and all 3 were determined to be polyethylene, not compostable bags. So this is a really important feedback loop, and we encourage you to take advantage of it. So we've been talking a lot about sort of industry activities. There also are some state and federal policy opportunities that we could use to address increasing access to composting. On the state level, we're very aware that Michigan has had some bill packages in the past looking to update the solid waste law, some of which would have directed more funding, collected off of landfill-bound materials. And we're all ears for how to support that. So, if it gets reintroduced, we're very eager to figure out how we can support that and make that as beneficial as possible for the composting industry. In other states, we see 2 basic mechanisms for addressing compost infrastructure. One is around organic waste diversion mandates. And there are kind of 2 different approaches to oversimplify that states are taking on this. There's sort of the West Coast model and the East Coast model. And the West Coast model is maybe not surprisingly a little bit more all in. It's California and Washington have required jurisdictions to offer organic waste collection to all businesses and all households, regardless of size. These are really aggressive programs. They're 1383 in California is being rolled out right now as we speak. And we'll see how it goes. These were initiatives that had no funding associated with them, so they are going to be challenging. On the East Coast, it's a bit of a softer touch, focused more on businesses. And so in various shapes or forms, you see states that have passed requirements that businesses generating over a certain amount of food per month. So typically this is going to be things like supermarkets, stadiums, corporate or university campuses that are generating a lot of food per month are going to be required to divert that food to composting if a composting facility is within a certain mile radius. Now, again, the number of tons per month and the mile radius differ in each of these programs, and there are for sure some other differences, but a slightly different approach. Both, I think, are helping to drive compost access in different ways. Then there's extended producer responsibility, which we've seen pass now in 4 different states, 2 last year, 3 this year, although some would say California maybe is not truly an EPR program. And these extended producer responsibility programs are essentially passing requirements to collect fees on packaging and use those funds to pay for oftentimes the collection and the processing of packaging materials. Traditionally, EPR programs have not included funds going to composters, even though compostable products and packaging, small portion of the waste stream, very small, but it's still there. And those funds are not going to composters. They're going to recycling facilities. And so we've been advocating pretty heavily, along with the U.S. Composting Council, how do we make sure that some of these funds are going to composters to help them with the cost of processing compostable packaging? And how do we make sure that composters and compostable packaging companies, when possible, are on state advisory panels for these EPR programs? We were pretty successful with this in Colorado and California. We were a little too late for Maine and Oregon to get that baked in. If you're interested in this, on our website under the advocacy section, you can see a joint position that BPI and the U.S. Composting Council put out, sort of outlining generally what we're advocating for in EPR programs. At the federal level, last year, there was a big push, a new coalition formed of the U.S. Compost Infrastructure Coalition. BPI was a founding member of this group, and we helped develop something called the Compost Act, which was a federal grant and loan initiative to provide money to both private and public entities to support food waste composting to get towards a national compost infrastructure. It failed to advance. Pieces of it may be able to be worked into the Farm Bill, but it still sort of helped lay some groundwork for what are the needs. What is the amount of money that we really think we need over a 10-year period? to get this going, whether that comes from federal sources or other means. More actively, there's the Recycling and Composting Accountability Act, which passed in the Senate and is now in the House. And this would authorize EPA to research and report on collection and processing infrastructure, end markets, barriers. So think back to this biocycle data and find a composter and how difficult it is to really quantify what's going on and what the barriers are. This RCAA would really advance and change that and make sure that at a federal level, we have insights for recycling and composting and what is happening today and what needs to be done to fix that. And I think pretty excitingly, in connection back to Michigan, earlier this year, BPI had the opportunity to testify in support of this bill alongside Michigan's own Detroit Dirt. Sort of more hot off the press is the Inflation Reduction Act. We're digging into that and looking at how provisions could incentivize compost use, such as through funds going to the National Natural Resources Conservation Service to encourage conservation efforts. So to wrap things up, what would make the practice of composting food scraps more widespread? I'd say organics diversion legislation that specifically calls out packaging as part of the organic stream. And again, there are different models for this, as you can see. Labeling legislation that establishes consistency, creates minimum requirements, and helps eradicate lookalike compostable products. So Washington has definitely gone the furthest on this. We're still not sure exactly how well that will work in Washington, but it sort of sets some ground rules for us to work with. Funding, both via voluntary means as well as through regulatory programs like extended producer responsibility, noting that composters, it does take more money and effort to accept packaging besides just food scraps. And then more efforts around consumer education on this connection between food scraps, climate change, composting, compostable products, right? These are not things that I think are part of the common lexicon. And so finding ways to build this into K through 12 education, using the brands who are interested in this to use their packaging and their products as a communication piece to highlight this connectivity. So thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to answering some questions with you all.
Thank you so much, Rhodes. Now, before we get to our Q&A, I'd like to share an application of compostable products that our organization was involved in last week, thanks to the support of the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes Energy, and Pactiv Evergreen, BPI member and manufacturer of compostable food service products, formerly known in Michigan through its recently acquired subsidiary, Fabri-Kal in Kalamazoo. Through this partnership, we are able to support the green team of the Hispanic Center of West Michigan to make the West Michigan Hispanic Festival a functionally zero waste to landfill event. Food and fruit service products are processed by the new City of Grand Rapids compost facility, with a balance of recyclable materials processed by the Kent County Recycling Center. More than 100 cases of pineapples and 20,000 beer cups were diverted from the landfill as a result of this effort. This places the Hispanic Festival, the largest Spanish language event in the state and largest cultural event outside of Detroit, among the state's largest sustainable events. The majority of which, I should note, are made possible by the Sustainable Events Program at our webinar series sponsor, Shupan. I'd like to highlight this because not only is it a great example of the use of the BPI products, but also to note that if an organization where the majority of its vendors and volunteers are doing business in Spanish can make this possible, I think it's possible for just about any event to be able to move forward through it. And thank you for allowing me to share. And Rhodes, looking forward to going through some questions here today.
Yeah, excited to chat with you.
So the first one, this is from Roger Carville. There's so many imitation compostable products out there available to purchase. And I think for imitation, we're going to interpret it as products that are purportedly compostable, but are not. What is BPI doing to impact false marketing?
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing that we've done over the years is support state legislation that defines what can be marketed and sold as compostable. So California was the first, and it predated my time at BPI, but it was over a decade ago that California passed the first iteration. And at that time, compostable products, the concern was really around bags specifically, and that was an easier piece of legislation to pass. And then over time, California expanded that. So basically, expanded their law to cover all products, and it gets updated every few years. There was actually an update to it last year to further correct things. And what those laws do, they exist in California, Washington, Maryland, and Minnesota has one still just for bags. And what they do is say you can't market something as biodegradable or degradable because that's inherently misleading, right? You need to define the environment in which it's going to biodegrade. Consumers don't know what that means. Albeit they might not know what compostable means either. Biodegradable, really, like, what does that mean to them? It's inherently misleading. And what they do is then say, well, compostable product must be appropriately labeled. And I think that is probably the biggest thing that we could do is in the state of Michigan is look to see is there an appetite for putting some of these restrictions on what products can be claimed as compostable, and then find business associations that can really help enforce that. So in California, that's Californians Against Waste, CAW, that has been a real watchdog of that, right? They have take in reports from the public. They also purposefully go out into supermarkets and then submit the reports to the Attorney General. And there have been several large lawsuits that have helped clean up the marketplace in California. BPI itself, we do the best that we can. Whenever somebody reports something to us, we put it into our job tracker and follow up and pursue it. But if it's a product that's not infringing on our trademark of certification, it's really hard, right? We aren't a regulatory body ourselves. We have no legal action or claims over the word compostable itself, really just things that are connected to certification. So it is a challenge. For sure. I hear Roger on that one.
Yeah, and I think that probably tracks with a lot of things we see in the sustainability world, where things are marketed as eco-friendly, green, recyclable, without any certification or verification necessarily back that up. And I think it's difficult to just kind of say buyer beware, but if you're buying sustainable products, you have to be more of an educated consumer, I think.
Right. Yeah.
Doug Wood asks, are there any legislative efforts in Michigan in this area?
Yeah, besides that Part 115 from a few years ago, I'm not aware of any, but again, as a national organization, we really rely on partners like this group or the Michigan Recycling Coalition. And I think in the pandemic times, we've fallen a little bit out of touch with the Michigan Recycling Coalition. We were closer in touch with them back when Part 115 was more active. So yeah, we're all ears on what we could do to support efforts in Michigan, either things that are already underway or things that we could start and help spearhead from afar. So yeah, I'm not aware of any initiatives like this happening in Michigan.
I happen to be very involved with the Michigan Recycling Coalition myself, and I'm a member of the Michigan Organics Council. I will affirm that legislative efforts in Michigan are at this moment limited to Part 115, which has been in the process of being passed and updated for a number of years. And for those aware, this is as Rose mentioned, is the package of bills that govern most of sustainable materials management in the states. Where I think if those are interested in kind of learning more about these efforts and want to things that are impactful at the moment, people should be keeping an eye on not necessarily on to a certain extent Part 115, but at this moment your local policies and zoning and permits. It is very difficult for compost operations in the states to get local approval to site the facilities, and it is probably the largest barrier to standing up a compost operation presently in the states. And I'm aware of any given time, one composter or another struggling with some local issues and trying to move things forward and being the best partner of the local communities. But what they really need is for the local elected officials, for the local administrators, to hear from residents and businesses that they support this activity and want to see it move forward.
Yeah, and for the compost permits, I know that U.S. Composting Council has been updating its resources with its model permit rule, because that is a really big issue across many states. Or just the difficulty and the costs of permitting composting facilities to take food scraps, which is done at a state level. There is no federal guidance on that, and so they have a model permit rule. So I definitely think that if that is one of the top barriers in Michigan, having U.S. Composting Council's resources could be really helpful there, sort of, which outline, what that permit rule could look like, and rationale of why it should be, sufficiently protective of the environment. Because that's oftentimes what those old permit rules are in place for, is maybe there was a bad actor many years ago, and then suddenly there's a backlash, right? And it becomes as hard to set up a composting facility as it is a landfill. In general terms, is what we've seen around the U.S. And so, yeah, it takes some effort to sort of walk that back and set up reasonable permits.
This is a question I was looking for. I was going to ask it. It didn't come up. If it didn't come up, Robert Swain asks: is there a difference between BPI and the new CMA certification for compostability?
Sure. So I think there are a lot of differences between all certifiers, right? So between BPI and CMA, or BPI and European certifications, there are always going to be differences. Some, maybe appear to be subtle, while, could be significant for particular audiences. And so I think, sort of at a high level, the biggest difference is that CMA is offering field testing, right? So BPI today, while you see all the field testing activities that we're involved with, developing a standardized field test, we don't have that as a requirement in our certification today, partly because there is no ASTM test that we could build into a certification. We feel like, built into our bylaws and our organization's mission, BPI will not certify to things that don't have independent tests and specifications. So again, this kind of connects back to even European certifiers. A reason we don't have home compostability certification, which we're investigating right now, is partly there is no ASTM standard or ISO international standard for home compostability. We're not willing to sort of develop that rule ourselves. We feel like we need a voluntary consensus group to develop an independent standard. So that's probably the highest level thing. Down in the weeds, there are for sure other differences. We've been around for a long time, so we've got very clear certification scheme published on our website. We really have led the way with the PFAS development of PFAS rules around the world as a certifier, our on-product labeling requirements. But I think those are maybe down in the weeds. I think at the high level, right, it's about field testing.
Yeah, thank you, Rhodes. And and I think we are finding that coming up a little bit in this Michigan, as there at least two prominent compost facilities are affiliated with the CMA certification, and and I think we're finding that the majority of products, if they meet BPI, they almost certainly also meet at CMA. But it's I think people are finding they have to educate themselves on that fairly quickly.
Yeah, and I think part of the reason that CMA grew out of the Cedar Grove testing program in Washington State really was around this concern of real world versus lab conditions. And if you think about this, right, for any lab testing or any certifications, what we need to do from a scientific perspective is reduce the number of variables so you get consistent results. And in the real world, whether that's composting or any other practice, there are almost uncountable variables, right? And that's different types of composting facility technologies, the weather conditions, how you run the facility. So you may have similar technologies, windrow and windrow, or Gore system and Gore composting system, but you may run them differently, and that may change depending on the feedstocks coming in that day. And I think that's what's been so challenging, and I know that that's behind why CMA exists, is to help build evidence and for a specific composter to trust that products will work in their system. And I think that the ASTM standardized test method will really go a long way of making that a more public process, right? And make it more widespread, so that it's not just, today, 2 facilities in Michigan who've sort of bought into this CMA model. We think that all composters would benefit from more information on how products are breaking down. And we want to make sure that there's a system to get that data out to everyone, and that we have a feedback mechanism to update the ASTM standards that we use. And we just don't have that feedback loop today. So again, I think that's what that ASTM method will do, and I hope that will help all composters across Michigan.
Rhodes, can compost be OMRI certified if it contains certified compostable feedstocks?
Yeah, so OMRI, the Organic Material Review Institute, they're an independent, they're a nonprofit body that is probably the best known across the US for certifying or approving things for inputs into organic agriculture. And one of the things they do is, look at compost applications to see if that compost can be an input to organic farms. And today, they do allow certain things to be included, certain food soiled papers linked to a rule around recycled paper at the National Organic Program. They have a list of approved synthetic substances, and recycled paper is on that list. But the short answer is no. Today, compostable packaging can't be an input as a feedstock to composters if they want that to get OMRI listed or any other review body like CDFA in California. This is a big barrier in certain markets, right? We know compost that is marketed as an input for organic ag can sell for more money. So whether it's going to an organic farm or not, that's a missed value proposition for a composter. So we have been working on this with US Composting Council for the last year or two. Things have really heated up in California. Last year, they actually built into that labeling law we were talking before and said, by 2026, if we have not solved this, we won't be able to market or sell products as compostable in the state of California. In other words, they have to become an approved input for bodies like OMRI by 2026, or there are no compostable products in California. That's how big of an issue this is in California. It's a lesser issue, but still an issue in other states. And so we are feverishly working on that with compost groups in California and the national body on different strategies to try to fix that.
And Rhodes, at this point, we have more questions. I think we have time, so we'll try to get through as many of it as we can in the remaining minutes here. Is BPI looking at compostable alternatives for management packaging, such as on-site digestion?
Yes and no. So we are very aware of these sort of, I think the variety of means, and I think this can kind of connect to the home compost question too, right? Yeah. We for sure see that it's not one size fits all, right? The US is a wide and diverse, beautiful place, right? Not everyone's going to have curbside access to collection. Sometimes it's going to be a drop-off program, which would still go to a commercial site, maybe, or maybe it would go to a community composter. New York City is a good example of that, right? More than 8 million people. There's lots of news about their restart of their composting program with, drop-off bins. Some of that drop-off material goes to community composters. For certain businesses, on-site processing, might be the best option. Some of those on-site processors are really like dewatering or dehydrating just to reduce the volume. Compostable products and packaging probably aren't going to do too well in that, right? It's just dehydrating or dewatering, and then you send that smaller mass to a composter later. If you're actually composting or digesting on-site, I think that there are more opportunities for that. And we know that, for instance, rotating drums, which were a technology from way long ago in the composting world, have pretty good success breaking down packaging in a short time frame. Other systems, it really is going to be system by system based on like augers and other equipment inside that unit. But yeah, it's definitely something that we're paying attention to, as well as home compostability and standards around that.
I think we kind of covered the backyard composting question just now. Is there good data on how compostability as an attribute can lead to lower levels of microplastics where products are lost to the environment?
Good data, no. Emerging data, yes.
Okay.
So there's a little bit of data. I can find the article. There's an article in Biocycle magazine that starts to look at assessment of microplastics in compost coming from curbside programs. And in that one study from Spain, no compostables were found in those microplastics. And so if you search Biocycle microplastics, you'll come up with that study. That said, we need to do a lot more investigation of this, right? It's going to depend on the system for sure, like anything. But no, there There aren't a lot of studies in general about microplastics in the soil. There is a lot of research being done on that, and a lot of concern around depackaging equipment in particular. Depackaging equipment, hence its name, was designed for off-spec packaged food, but increasingly it's being used to also clean up contaminated curbside organics. And so there's a lot of concern around this. And Vermont has a big research project underway right now where they're looking at pulling back the permits they gave for depackaging equipment around this concern of microplastics. And that may be, yes, removing the large pieces of the packaging, but maybe creating microplastics. It's an interesting study. I don't know if depackaging equipment is creating more microplastics than other systems per se, but it's for sure something we need to look at. And from our side, we want to make sure that compostables are not in there, or are a really small portion, and what happens to them once they are released into the soil. Do they continue to break down or not?
Great. I think this is going to be our last question today, Rose. Really appreciate taking the time with us and sharing all this great information. So I understand that it may not make sense to label non-food food items as biodegradable compostable because it could interfere with food composting. However, with so much of our plastics not being recycled ending up in our environment, what is stopping us from creating program certifications for harder soft goods that are compostable but aren't food products? And I'm going to interpret this as paper, cardboard.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think what as you've heard so much today, right? There are a lot of issues with just getting items associated with things in the composting stream successfully collected and composted today. And I think that's why BPI has sort of narrowed that focus, even if it's a limiting of opportunities. I think the other aspect of that, though, is there's a lot of redesign that needs to be done, for materials, going into the waste stream today. And we want to make sure that we're not pigeonholing things, right? We don't know what that redesign is going to look like. When is reuse going to work? There's a lot of debate about that. What counts as reusable? Canada is looking at, calculating this partly based on how many times an item can go through a dishwasher. It's like, okay, well, some single-use cutlery, compostable or otherwise, might be able to go through a dishwasher. Does it suddenly become reusable? Is that a good thing to make it more durable just so it can pass the dishwasher test, even if it's still only used once? And so I think that's the concern, right, of getting into this is for sure, we need to figure out all the other materials that are going to landfills today. But we don't want to necessarily carve off too much of that pie because it might not make sense. And paper, Dan, is a great example of that, right? There's a ton of innovation happening at Western Michigan University around research of paper and how to make paper more recyclable. And that's great work. It's work that we need. There's too much material going to the landfill. It's not a competition about end of life. And I think for BPI, that's why we sort of narrowed that focus. Is we want to show that we're part of this broader system to redesign to get things out of landfills and be reusable, and that we're not in competition with recycling. We're not in competition with reuse. There's going to be more than enough for compostable materials alone. So that's why for us, we've narrowed that focus, but it's a great question.
Rhodes, again, thank you so much for taking the time today. For everyone participating, we will be sending out Rhodes's slides shortly here. This will have his contact information available to him. Please, check out BPI's website, bpi.org. And plan to buy BPI products when you get an opportunity to.
Thanks again for having me. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, and thanks again everyone for joining. We should be announcing our next webinar in the next few days here, and hope we'll see you at one of our upcoming in-person events.